Hi, and welcome to Transformational Selling, the podcast for sellers, sales managers, sales leaders, and entrepreneurs, those who want to improve their skills and techniques and smash their targets. I'm Steve Lowndes.
And I'm Bryn Thompson.
And together we're directors at New World Selling and authors of the book Transformational Selling, How to Adapt Your Sales Style in the New World. Okay, so another episode.
Yep.
An interesting week globally, an interesting week. Let's see how that pans out. But in terms of what's caught your attention, aside from necessarily global politics, what's caught your attention this week, or what's been the main takeaway for you?
Well, definitely there's a new world order, no pun intended, with our business.
Yeah.
But I think even on a macro or micro level, the new world for a lot of companies is new quarter, for some companies, new financial year, targets going back to zero, and some uncertainty going forward. I think that's probably fair to say about the economy. How are they going to meet those targets? How are they going to grow? How businesses are going to scale? I'm sure a lot of those plans are in place, but now it's about delivering on them.
It's an interesting time, but I think, we've been here before. This isn't the first wobble that we've seen in the economy down the years in terms of that. We saw it with COVID, we saw it after Brexit, we saw it after
Banking crisis
2007, we saw it after the dot-com bubble 2001. We could keep going back in terms of that. So I guess the main thing is, whatever happens, what's the advice that you would give as someone who's been through this 4 or 5 times now, and probably more? What advice would you be giving to sellers now who perhaps are going through a bit of economic turbulence for the first time?
For sellers, trust in the process, keep your beliefs strong, be proactive, be bolder, as we said in the last episode, and don't be frightened to challenge your clients' thinking. Disrupt your clients' thinking. I think big theme of what we're going to discuss today, really.
It feels like a theme, actually, we discuss most weeks, but I think it's so key. I love that. I think the 2 things that I would say there that really stand out: trust the process. As a seller, I have absolutely zero influence over global economy, UK economy. I have no influence over any of that. All I can do is do the right things of sufficient quantity and quality to drive those results, and keep looking at results and going, how can I get better? So it's all about that process. I've got to follow that process and try and refine that and make it as good as I can. And the second piece, again, which always stands out for me, is let's challenge some thinking around there. For every downturn, it does create opportunities, it does create different needs, and we've got to present things in different ways, but we've also got to reframe our customers' thinking around that. So for me, that's absolutely massive, and I love that advice. For me, what have I picked up this week? Well, actually, I picked up something very interesting. So a book that I read last year, a great book, and I've gone back to it because I picked out, but I wanted to share an example from it. I thought it was great. So it's the second best sales book I've ever read, and probably the best sales book I've ever read that I didn't help write. So it's The Transparency Sale by Todd Caponi, and I don't know, I must lend it to. No, it comes really highly recommended. And actually, the reason I love it is because it really ties in with one of the core themes that we talk about, which is collaboration. So we talk about foster collaboration as part of transformational selling. And in Todd's book, he talks a lot about this idea of, he said, well, actually collaboration and really transparency. So this idea of being absolutely open for a couple of reasons. Yeah. One, ethically, we shouldn't be selling something whilst we're hiding information. But actually, this is about building trust. And the examples he gives are things like, actually, if you've got nothing but 5-star reviews on Amazon, people think, and actually, he said, ideally, if you've got somewhere between, I think, 4.2 and 4.7 out of 5 across that, people trust that a lot more than they do the 5-star review. But he was saying, well, actually in sales, the trouble is you ask a salesman and say, tell us about your product. What does the salesman do? They give it a 5-star review.
Yeah.
But actually, you probably have much greater impact if you give it a 4.2 or a 4.5 review. You talk about what's great, but you also talk about what it won't do. And I thought that was really compelling. And he took a really extreme case here. So he set the example of he was going into a pitch and he was up against a competitor. And he went into the pitch, and the CEO of the company was in there and 2 or 3 other key decision makers. And the CEO sort of said to him first, said, okay, great, looking forward to your pitch. He said, but first of all, cut to the chase. We've just had so-and-so come in and pitch, your competitor up front. Tell us why you're better. And the natural thing that I think 99% of salespeople would do is they go, oh, well, we're better because, and give a list of things. And he said, I flipped the script and said, let me tell you 3 things that they can do that we can't. And he said, and if any of those are absolute must-haves for you, we can probably end it there.
Yeah.
And the guy said, okay. And he listed off the 3 things. He said, any of those absolute must-haves? And the guy went, well, not necessarily. He went, great. Put it aside. Now let me talk about what we can do. And he said the whole piece around it was, instead of client going, oh, he said, the trust you build up when you do that. He said, and it feels like quite a bold move. He said, but the trust you build up meant that everything I said after that point was taken as read, it was trusted, it was accurate. He said, and actually, he said, you could tell the tension in the room dropped having done that, and it allowed him to go through. It's a fantastic example of that whole transparency piece. Really counterintuitive, but I loved that story because I think actually there's so many things in sales that are really counterintuitive, but actually from a psychological, from a trust, and from an engagement point of view, are really good things to do.
Yeah, and I think that equally applies to sales training, really, that if you go in and say, yeah, we're going to do these 2 or 3 days and everyone's going to be incredible at the end of it, rather than going, look, there's a few reasons why it might not work. One is you've got to make sure that people start doing it. You've got to observe it. Secondly, your managers have got to coach it and they've got to be equipped to know how to coach it. And thirdly, from our point of view, it's got to be designed fit for purpose. So we need to spend a bit of time to understand your business to make it relevant, contextual and specific to the needs that you require, so that they can go out, the following week and start to actually practice it. But if you don't do that, you might be better off not spending your money.
Do you know what? And that's great. And that prompted, because that was exactly the same thought that went through. When I picked that book up, I was looking at it again, and I thought, do you know what? I remember a while back, I did used to start a lot of proposal presentations that I'd go through. I used to start them with, here's some of the reasons why sales training fails.
Yeah.
And I put that in up front, and then I'd show how we intended to overcome that. I've stopped doing that. I should start doing that. I think we still talk about it, but I'm probably not as explicit. And I think the thought occurred to me, I should go back to doing that, because that is actually, and it is honest and transparent, because you're right. If we don't do any of these things, actually the client probably isn't going to get the best value for money. So brilliant. Which brings me on to the topic for today. And the topic for today is one that I think we've alluded to previously, but it comes back to this idea of, why are most deals in sales lost? And, if you look at most CRMs, you go onto your HubSpot or your Salesforce and go, reason lost. And 9 times out of 10 they say, well, there'll be lots and lots of different reasons, and, lost on price or went to a competitor. But actually, the number one reason that sales are lost,
clients decide to stay with what they've got or do nothing.
Client decided to do nothing. And that's the fundamental reason. And it all comes down to change. And as salespeople, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get our clients to change what they do. But in order to change what they do, they've got to change their thinking. And really, that's at the essence of sales. And that's what I want to talk about today, because actually change is not natural for most people. It's going to concern, it causes issues and everything else. The easiest decision for any of us to make is to not make a decision or to put it off down the road. And our job as salespeople is to kind of meet that challenge head on. So that's what I thought we'd talk about today, change, and maybe start with getting your feelings around why is change difficult for people, do you think?
Well, I think change brings with it a lot of negative emotions. We talk about 84% of decisions being emotionally driven. And if you think about what you have to do when you change, it involves upheaval, it involves stress, it involves hassle, it usually involves cost, probably involves training. So there's so many things that make people think, do I really want to go down that route and go through all those negative emotions to get to the other side? So I think it's so easy for people to go, do you know what? We'll just stick with what we've got. And that's why it becomes very difficult to supplant an existing supplier, particularly somebody who's been embedded in a business for quite a long time, or to get somebody to actually take an action decision to do something completely different.
And that's really interesting. Interesting you should bring up about the existing supplier, because I think people assume, and I see a lot of salespeople try and oust an existing supplier with, and I'm not saying they're not necessarily good initial exploration questions, but what would you like to see them do better, or where could they improve, etc. Great place to start, but here's the actual issue that we're always going to come up against. Even if there is room for improvement, better the devil you know. And one of the things that gets reading up in a number of different places, and actually Todd Caponi's book also talks about this, is human beings like predictability. And the one thing I know is my current supplier, even if they're only quite good, it's predictable that they're quite good. And you, as a potential new supplier, are an unknown quantity. And from that particular perspective, emotionally, everything that you've said there, you're absolutely right. I'm going to lean towards what I know. I'm going to lean towards what's predictable. So actually ousting a supplier, and I guess probably that's the same, even if you haven't got a supplier, this is a new product or a new service, but all right, the manual way that we were doing it or our old process might not be perfect, but it is predictable. And we do know what we're dealing with.
Yeah, and I think we talked about IBM earlier. The old principle that probably no longer rings true. Nobody ever got fired for choosing IBM.
Yeah.
That if you go away and make a decision to choose a different supplier, you kind of put your neck on the line. That supplier's got to give you better outcomes than the current one. So you are rolling the dice a bit before that actually happens. So for me, it's really getting the client to reframe their thinking, to sort of self-assess where they're really at, to look at the outcomes they're looking to achieve and go, are we really going to get there if we carry on doing what we're doing? Or particularly, if you take a company that's in, say, scale-up mode, are we really going to make that growth happen if we just keep doing the same thing over and over again?
And a couple of things that I'm going to pick out there actually, which is really interesting. So yes, you've got that little bit of a fear factor I think you alluded to, make the change. And there's plenty of stories of where organisations have made the change and got it wrong. I don't know if you remember, going back a few years now, but do you remember when Kentucky Fried Chicken, KFC, ran out of chicken?
I do.
And that was, again, a catastrophic failing of a change of supplier. And I think it was to do with logistics, wasn't it? And transport. And they made a change, probably, I don't know for sure, because they were offered a better deal or a cheaper price. They took the option, and it basically closed down practically almost every store because they just couldn't get the product to them. And there is a great example of the concern that the buyers have, saying, well, yeah, you might be able to offer a better solution, or you might be able to offer, in this case, a cheaper solution. But is it worth the risk? Is it worth the hassle? And is it worth that? And like you say, putting my neck on the line, because somewhere along the line, someone's responsible for someone's going to be made responsible if you make a poor decision. And I think understanding that as sellers and understanding there's reasons why buyers are concerned. There's reasons why, even though you might present what looks like a no-brainer, it will give them this, it will give them that, it might be a cheaper price and everything else. Everything stacks up and the logic says, here's why you'd be nuts not to make this change. And yet clients don't, because actually, back to your point, logic only drives so much of the decision-making process. There's a huge amount of unsurfaced emotion that challenges it. And that's all about that, at least if it's not a fear of change, it's a concern over change.
Yeah, and well, in the book we talk about tipping the scales from the fear of change against the fear of not changing, and you've got to tip the scales so the fear of not changing becomes greater than the fear of changing. And that is a conversation where you need to create that light bulb moment for the client where they go, do you know what, now we're thinking about it, I can see why change might be good here, because if we don't change, we're not going to achieve those outcomes that we're looking to do. So it goes back to that first principle that we came up with, which is focus on outcomes.
Yeah.
If for example, I'm talking to a CRO or somebody like that, and I'll say, what's your growth plan this year? Let's say it's a new financial year, and they go, it's 28%. A lot of people would say, the next question would be, how are you going to do it? I would say, no, that's not the right question. I'd say, what did you grow by last year? What are you currently growing by? Understanding that past, present, future to go, actually, if we've only been growing by, say, 10%, and we need to get to 28%, clearly we need to do something different.
Well, the second piece around that is then asking the question, and why 28%?
Well, yeah.
Because, which follows on, which, okay, again, is that imperative? Is that a pipe dream? Or actually, is there really some fundamental mechanics and reason why that needs to be achieved? And who's driving that?
As we know, it's not always the CRO's decision. As a former sales director for many years, you are given a number. You can argue that number to a certain extent, but if you've got, say, private equity or VC-backed businesses, they bought you for a reason. They've invested to really scale you up. And if you're not on that growth, and we see this a lot, people not on that growth curve that they need to be on, that doesn't stop the targets going up the following year. In fact, if you haven't achieved one year, those targets might be even greater the next year because you've fallen behind on it.
And you've got to make the shortfall because you're right. It's usually those targets aren't in isolation. And when you look at the targets, they might say, well, that's our target this year, but actually that's part of a 3 or a 5 year growth plan. And it just sits as, it's that much this year, but actually it ramps to this, etc., moving forward. So,
The one thing I would say about that, though, is having worked with quite a few private equity companies, I have noticed that quite often it's founder driven because the founder's looking for the exit. Obviously the PE is, but if the PE will probably go, well, if it takes us 4 years instead of 3 years to get there, we'll take it. What they want is accuracy. What they don't want is some kind of pie-in-the-sky pipeline forecast that never gets achieved.
So interesting. So they want accuracy. Actually, what do they want? They want predictability.
Correct.
Exactly the same as every one of our clients' ways. It all comes back to that, doesn't it? So let's have a look, because the bit I want to explore here, you talked about the tipping, and you're right. We represent it in the book, and we represent it like a set of scales or a seesaw or fulcrum, where on the one hand, you've got reasons not to buy. And actually, a lot of this is driven by that emotion, that fear of change, the uncertainty, doubts about what you're going to deliver. Will it work? Am I sticking my neck out beyond here? Is this too big a risk? And there's a hassle, a cost change. There's loads of reasons to just stick with what we've got. And when we're selling, and when you get to that stage of the profile, and we're trying to understand what's holding a customer back, I think most sellers make the mistake is they try and say, well, obviously at the moment, there's a big heavyweight weighing down on reasons not to do it. The cost, the hustle, everything else. So sellers go, oh, how can we tip it in our favor? Well, let's try and reduce some of those. So they try and, well, let's find ways in which we can make this less risky for you. And there may be valid ways they can do that. But I think the biggest issue is that instead of focusing on what's on that side of the scales that's weighing it down, maybe the biggest problem is there's not enough on the other side to tip the balance in your favor. And that's the reasons to make that change. Tell me about how, as a seller, we make the reasons to change much greater, that can outweigh those reservations, which actually are always going to be there. Yep. We're never going to remove those reservations. They're always going to be there. I think we have to accept it. I think the focus is we make the reasons to change bigger. How do you do that?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that we came up with that was a little bit different from the traditional, if you like, spin selling models and similar models from the 80s was it was all about finding pain points.
Yep.
What we said was really understanding, first of all, the success criteria that the client wants to achieve before we look at the challenges. Then if we understand what the business is looking to achieve and how each stakeholder in that process is KPI'd and measured, that's the starting point. Beyond that, we then need to start examining what could potentially get in the way of that. What we tend to find with sellers is once they find a bit of a challenge, success criteria here, challenge here, we know what they tend to do next. This is how we can fix it. And we always say that's not the time to do it. So this widening of the perception of the gap in your client's mind by probing deeper as to what's the potential consequence of doing that, what are the implications if you don't do that, we start to see that gap widening in the client's mind. The wider we can create the perception of the gap, the more likely they are to move forward and for us to gain a kind of win-win positive outcome.
So interesting there, because actually you used a bit of spin language in there. So we talked about implication and consequences. Yeah. And I guess the point here is the fact is, yes, we focus on the pains, but the pains don't really have any context unless we look at the customer outcomes as well.
Correct.
And if we look at what you're trying to achieve and then look at the pains that get in the way of you achieving that, now we have the context. Whereas, and you're right, I've seen so many sellers, the customer identifies a pain, they drill around it, and yes, it might be quite time consuming, it might be an issue, but if we don't relate, and how is that affecting then the success criteria and the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, if we're not making the link between that, then what we're solving is an irritation, but it's not necessarily an issue. It's just something that would be nice not to have to manually do that process. But if manually doing that process isn't impacting our ability to hit that metric, that output, then we're probably not going to change, or we don't have that compelling reason to do anything different. We have to look at not just how much of a pain it is, but it's only in context of how that is stopping you achieving those outcomes. And I think that's the core difference that potentially, and don't get me wrong, Spin Selling was the first book I ever read. It was the book that got me hooked on sales. If I'm going to be honest, I've been in sales a little bit before that until I read that book, and I just went, wow. And it absolutely exploded my mind. The power of asking questions rather than just pitching. It was incredible. I read it probably in the mid-90s. I loved that book. But I think you're right. I think the ability to drive pains is good, but it means nothing without the outcomes. And that's why our process, transformational selling, was always built on, let's find out what your outcomes are first. Then let's dig into what's stopping you from doing that.
And I think the most successful companies now are looking to partner with, that you're not becoming a supplier. You're becoming a partner, a trusted advisor for that company. And we've got to move away from this transactional approach. Let's get the deal, let's bring it in, because I'm under pressure to do so. without that actually having a material benefit for the client. So going back to what works well, what doesn't work so well, being transparent, again, talking about the book that you've just read, telling clients, if you don't do this, this could be a consequence to you. You'll need to do this as well. And that can link into all kinds of other areas like budget, for example. Yeah, you could do it for this price, but that's probably the outcome you're going to get. However, if you spent X, we think this is what you could do, and we think that's a good reason to get you a better outcome. Now, we know everybody has budgets, so that's where I believe it's always good to present options, not too many options, 2 or 3 at maximum, but look at, for this option, this is the outcome we think we can achieve for you. And I think it links inextricably into customer success. And I'm not convinced that all business development people and customer success people are joined up.
Right, I'm just going to hang on. I'm just going to challenge you on that one. You're suggesting that salespeople and customers... Right, yeah. I'm being slightly facetious there. It's the biggest challenge that we see in so many businesses. Actually, there's 1 or 2 where they're working really hard to line them up, and that's great and that's refreshing. In summary, we've talked about this idea of change being difficult for customers, and the number 1 reason why sales don't go ahead is not because they didn't like the product, not necessarily because they couldn't find their budget, but actually fear of change or the uncertainty around change meant it was easier to make a decision to push it back. Widening the gap is clearly the key to that. Give us, what are your top takeaways and the key, I guess, tips that you can give for sellers out there, things that they can be doing to widen that gap?
So, number 1, don't pitch too soon. It's so common that they just want to start talking about the product as soon as they see a bit of a pain point, going straight into how we can fix it. Yep. Stop doing it, keep probing, keep looking at not only the implications for the business, but how that might affect the person you're talking to, because that's where you gain the emotional resonance to go, do you know what, if I, that's going to land back on me. And thirdly, don't see it as fear-mongering. A lot of people go, I don't ask it because I don't want to unsettle the client. If you don't unsettle the client ever, and you don't challenge their thinking, they probably won't change. And what we're talking about here is being a catalyst for change. That is true transformational selling.
Perfect. I love that. And I love those ideas. So we've got to, I guess, certainly my favourite part of the show, Bryn's soapbox. Okay. And this is the bit where, again, I give you 30 seconds. I throw a topic your way that I think might get you on your soapbox. And as we mentioned at the start of the show, it's the start of a new quarter, which meant actually last week was the end of quarter. And your topic this week, 30 seconds on, tell me your thoughts on end of quarter discounting.
Yeah, it's very common, as we know, and can't say I've never got my team to do it when I've been trying to hit a number, especially if you get an override at the back of it. But the truth is this, it's not good for business generally if that deal is going to come in first week in April. So don't encourage sellers to do it if you know the deal's going to come in. I don't mind a little bit of a sweetener sometimes on a deal, but I think, swinging discounts that have low margin are not going to help if the following month that deal would have come in at full margin.
Excellent. And the other thing I would say is when we bear in mind the reasons why deals don't happen, and we go back to it's the risk, it's the uncertainty, it's the lack of transparency, that those kind of things that start to come in, you argue and go, well, actually, how does knocking a few % off the price change any of that? And the reality is, it doesn't.
And how does it also enable the client to achieve their outcome? Probably doesn't.
And it doesn't enable them to achieve their outcome. So actually, far better ways of doing that. I think, do you know what? That's a topic for another day we can look into. So thank you very much for your thoughts and your ideas from today's episode. We look forward to the next episode. But in the meantime, if you want to find out more about transformational selling, you can follow Transformational Selling on LinkedIn, or check out the book on Amazon. It's Transformational Selling, How to Adapt Your Sales Style in the New World. And we'll look forward to seeing you guys next time.
See you soon.
If you're enjoying the Transformational Selling podcast, hit the subscribe button. Alternatively, if you'd like to find out more about transformational selling, then check out our book, Transformational Selling, How to Adapt Your Sales Style to the New World, available from Amazon in all formats, paperback, ebook, and as an audiobook too. Look forward to seeing you on the next episode.